Chapter 1. Sydney Weatherby rode through the quiet city of Beckham on her way to the orphanage, where she volunteered 3 mornings per week. She loved riding when the town was so quiet, before most people had woken up and gotten their days started. She enjoyed working with the children, and often, all she did was play with them and keep them busy. Today, though, was a day that would be full of chores. It was spring cleaning time, and the orphans were expected to wash windows, scrub floors, and do all the things their mothers would have been doing had they been alive. Her long blonde hair flowed out behind her as she rode, though she knew it was supposed to be in a knot. At least her mother would say it should be in a knot. When she got to the orphanage, she'd brush it and pin it up, so she could escape her mother's wrath. Her mother hated her habit of riding her bike everywhere, though she'd been the one to get Sydney the bike when she was a girl of 12. Her mother had been convinced that a bicycle was the answer to the small pudge around Sydney's middle, and her mother had been right. She'd lost all the weight and turned into a beautiful athletic young woman. But she wouldn't stop riding the bicycle and challenging boys to ride with her. Her mother wasn't happy because she wanted her to flirt with the boys, not best them in bike races. Now she was 20, and still unmarried, spending her time biking and helping at the orphanage, when her parents wanted her to go to balls and have afternoon teas with potential mothers-in-law. None of that was for Sydney. An only child, Sydney had been given a boy's name, simply because there wasn't a girl's name picked out. They'd wanted more children, but Sydney, the great disappointment she was all they had. She stopped in front of the orphanage and rested her bike up against the side of the house. Someone would scold her for it later, but for now, it was fine where it was. Sometimes she let the orphans take turns on it and used it as a reward for good behavior. Walking into the house, she immediately helped make breakfast, though her mother would be scandalized if she realized the woman who ran the orphanage had taught her to cook. Sydney wasn't sure what her mother thought she did with the orphans, but it certainly wasn't cooking and cleaning. Those things were beneath her daughter as far as she was concerned. As soon as the table was set and food was on the table, Mrs. Anderson, the sweet matron of the home, nodded at Sydney. "Ring the bell." Sydney walked over to the bell that could be heard throughout the entire house, and took a deep breath, before nodding at Mrs. Anderson. She rang the bell loudly, and then the two of them waited for the onslaught. It came just as quickly as they expected it to. Children who hadn't eaten in 12 hours came running down the stairs, sliding down the banister, and yelling with excitement. They all had assigned seats at the table, and each one sat down, obediently bowing their heads for their prayer. "Jimmy, it's your turn to pray," Mrs. Anderson said. Sydney grinned as she bowed her own head, giving it a slight shake. Jimmy's prayers always made her smile. "Oh, gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this meal you have provided. We also thank you for not allowing Mrs. Anderson to find the puppy Aaron smuggled into the boys' bedroom last night. For helping us get away with stealing penny candies from the mercantile, and for not making it rain today so we can play baseball all day. You truly are a good God. Please help us find a way to get out of doing spring cleaning today, because as you know, we like the house messy. It feels like a home that way. In the name of your Son, Christ Jesus, we pray. Amen. And be women, but don't tell Mrs. Anderson I said be women. She hates that." By the time he reached the end, all the orphans were snickering. Sydney turned her back to the table entirely, but she knew the children would see her shoulders shaking. Oh, how she wished her mother would allow her to adopt Jimmy and live in a little house in the country. She'd asked, but her mother said it would be harder to marry her off if she had a child. When Sydney had pointed out that all the men her mother wanted her to marry were stuffed shirts, her mother had told her she would be marrying, and soon. Sydney didn't understand why her mother still had so much control over her though. They were a year away from the turning of the century. The 20th century was certain to change the way women were treated, and it couldn't happen soon enough. Sydney turned back to the table, watching as the orphans all fell on their meal as if they were starving, when in truth, they ate very well for orphans. Mrs. Anderson stood frowning at Jimmy. He sometimes confessed to things they'd never done in prayers to make her look into something that hadn't happened so they could get away with things that had. And sometimes he told the truth. There was no knowing what he was up to, but he was always up to something. Mrs. Anderson handed Sydney the children's assignments for the day, and Sydney obediently read them aloud. By the time she was done, all the children had sunk low in their seats, and Sydney could tell it was time for her to do something to bolster the spirits. Jimmy, Aaron, and Howard, we get to wash all the windows outside. That's going to be fun. Whoever washes the most windows, without leaving any spots or streaks, gets to ride my bike for 15 minutes. The three boys lifted their heads, looking excited. But what about us girls? Molly, a relatively new orphan, asked. We have to wash the inside of all the windows and do lots of other things. Sydney thought about it for a moment. How about this? I'll have Mrs. Anderson pick the best worker from each of the inside groups, and I'll bestow some sort of reward on you next time I come. I'll try to make the reward fit the child. Molly looked at Mrs. Anderson, who reluctantly agreed with a nod. But you must remember that working is done simply to make the house better. Not so you will receive rewards. Sydney grinned that her idea had been agreed with. If she'd asked Mrs. Anderson earlier, the woman never would have agreed, but by asking in front of the children, she really had no choice. Regular chores are done before spring cleaning? Sydney asked. Yes, of course. Dishes must still be done, and the house must still be swept. Nothing can be done until the daily chores are taken care of. Mrs. Anderson couldn't help but smile at the youngest orphan, Agatha, who looked at her with a smile. Yes, you can help wipe the dishes dry, Agatha. The next few hours were an absolute whirlwind for the entire household. It was well past 2 in the afternoon when Sydney noticed the time. She was supposed to be home and dressed for tea by 3. Her mother was not going to be pleased. She hurried to Mrs. Anderson. I have to go. I need to be dressed for tea at 3. Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened. There's no way you can make it that quickly. Wish me luck. Maybe you could have Jimmy pray for me, Sydney called back over her shoulder as she threw her leg over her bike and started pedaling for all she was worth. It was 3:20 when she walked into the parlor for tea with her mother and the potential mother-in-law of the day. Her mother glared at her. Ah, here is my daughter, Sydney Ann. She's been volunteering at the orphanage. Sydney nodded, sliding demurely into the seat left for her. I do apologize for my lateness. I simply lost track of time as I do often when I'm working with the children. Sydney, this is Mrs. Sloane. She's one of the Boston Sloanes. Sydney smiled sweetly. Being one of the Boston Sloanes must mean something, but Sydney had no idea who the woman was. Probably some banker's wife with a son named something awful like Percival, who couldn't find anyone to marry her uncoordinated, unattractive son. It's so good to meet you, Mrs. Sloane. Tell me about your work at the orphanage, Mrs. Sloane said. I've always thought about volunteering with orphans, but instead, I just donate old clothes and things my family no longer needs. Oh, working with the orphans is such fun, Sydney said. Today we were doing spring cleaning, and I had 3 boys I was supervising as they washed the outside of every window of the orphanage. Mrs. Anderson, the matron, always gives me the 3 worst behaved boys, because I can get them to do anything. I told the boys whoever washed the most windows without leaving any spots or streaks could ride my bicycle for 15 minutes, and they all worked as hard as they could. Mrs. Sloane gaped at Sydney. You ride a bicycle? In skirts? I wear bloomers underneath my skirts, Sydney said, refusing to back down though her mother was glaring at her. If you marry my Percival, you'll have to act like a lady, and that would mean no more bloomers and no more bicycles. From the look in Mrs. Sloane's eyes, Sydney was certain the woman would do something drastic if she wasn't an obedient daughter-in-law. And Sydney had no doubt she would be incapable to obeying the woman. Sydney tried not to laugh when the man's name really was Percival. "Oh, is that a requirement? I must withdraw my application then." "Application? This isn't a job you're interviewing for." Mrs. Sloane glared at her, and then looked at her mother as if to find an ally there. "Feels like it," Sydney said, getting to her feet. "Don't worry, Mother. I'll see myself out." With that, Sydney went through the kitchen to the side exit of the house. "I'll be back in a few hours." Mrs. Sanders, the cook, shook her head. "Oh, you've made your mother mad again, haven't you? See you soon." Sydney felt a twinge of guilt, knowing the servants would be the ones to have to deal with her mother's wrath. Sydney walked down the street and once again stared up at the Tandy house. Mrs. Tandy sent women to be mail-order brides out west. Even though the West wasn't really known as wild any longer, she knew that many women in the West did real work and didn't flaunt themselves in their very finest every evening trying to make their husbands look better. She had no desire to marry a stranger, but the idea wasn't as abhorrent as marrying a man who would expect her to be a part of society like her mother did. No, she would instead go to Mrs. Tandy and see if she'd find her a husband. Then she wouldn't have to worry about her mother parading her in front of every suitor from Boston to New York. Before she lost her nerve, she marched straight up to the house and knocked loudly. It only took a moment for Mr. Tandy to come to the door. He looked surprised to see her, but smiled after a moment. "Miss Weatherby, how can I help you today?" When the Tandys had married, her mother had seen it as terribly scandalous. She didn't feel a woman like Elizabeth should marry her butler. No, in her mother's mind, no one should marry their butler. Though she'd been too young to marry herself, Sydney had silently cheered the couple on. "Would it be all right if I talked to Mrs. Tandy? My business is of a personal nature." Still wearing the clothes her mother approved of, she felt as if she had to display some semblance of manners. She was going to get an earful when she got home already. "Of course. Come in." Mr. Tandy gave her a knowing look, and she realized he knew what her business was about. Everyone knew how difficult her mother was, and how progressive Sydney's ideas were. No, he'd understand perfectly. She followed him down the hall, to the last door on the left, which was open, and a blonde woman sat at a desk where she was reading something. "Elizabeth? You have a visitor," Mr. Tandy said. Mrs. Tandy turned to her for a moment, and then smiled. "Come in. Have a seat and tell me what's happening." The two of them had a passing acquaintance, but Mrs. Tandy was different than most of the women who lived on Rock Creek Road, in that she was raised a poor woman, and had become a businesswoman through an act of benevolence. Sydney moved to the sofa, while Mr. Tandy said he would get tea for them. Sydney wanted to tell the man she was chock full of tea and good manners, but she restrained herself. "My mother is determined for me to marry a man with a high place in society. I'm determined to wear bloomers in public and ride my bicycle wherever I please. One of us is going to end up miserable, and as it's my life, I'd rather it wasn't me." Mrs. Tandy nodded. "So, you're considering becoming a mail-order bride and would like me to assist you?" "Exactly." Sydney couldn't back down now. She had to go through with it or let her mother have her way, in which case she may as well jump off the tallest building in town. No man with a high place in society would ever allow his wife to go about in bloomers. "I just received this letter. Now the man sending it hasn't been as thoroughly investigated as usual, but my husband has placed some telegrams and gotten a good response. Would you like to read the letter?" Sydney nodded, anxious to see what kind of man Elizabeth saw for her. "I would." As soon as she had the letter, Sydney read through it slowly, a slow smile coming to her face. "To whom it may concern. I'm looking for an unusual woman. One who wouldn't be embarrassed to wear bloomers in public. One who is not afraid to do things most society women wouldn't. I have a house in Fort Worth, Texas, and I would welcome a woman who is willing to work. No woman who thinks life should be a bed of roses need apply. Pay your own way to Fort Worth, and I will take care of the rest of your expenses. I look forward to meeting you. I'm a well-known businessman, so all you need to do is ask for me once you are off the train. Sincerely, Randy Ranch. After reading the letter a second and third time, Sydney nodded. I do believe this is the man for me. He sounds like he has no worries about his wife being a perfect lady, and that's the main thing I'm trying to avoid. The tea came then, and Mrs. Tandy offered some cookies. If you are certain, you may do it, and I won't send any other ladies. Sydney nodded. I'll need to say goodbye to the orphans, but I may not bother to tell my mother. We all know she won't be pleased, though I think my father might be. He's tired of her constant nagging about me getting a good husband. I think it is safe to say that good is in the eye of the beholder, don't you? I do. I'll leave Monday. It was just Friday, so she would have a couple of days to pack her things and go. Would you be willing to send my belongings on to me? I'll only take my bicycle and a small carpet bag on the train. Oh, happily. Bring them to me, and I'll send them in care of my sister, Susan. She lives outside Fort Worth with her husband and children. What's her last name now? Perhaps I could look her up while I'm there. I think that would be lovely. Her married name is Dailey. Sydney got to her feet and shook Elizabeth's hand. Thank you so much. Just remember, if he ever hurts you in any way, you shouldn't stay. You should come home or go straight to my sister who will help you. I won't forget. As Sydney left the Tandy house, she felt as if she had a new lease on life. She was going to be happy despite her mother's machinations. Chapter 2. True to her word, Sydney packed up her belongings and bribed some servants to take them to the Tandys' home. On Saturday morning, she rode out to the orphanage on the other end of town and brought prizes for the children who had earned them. She brought 3 of her old dolls and several coins for the boys. After distributing prizes, she went to Mrs. Anderson and whispered what she was about to do. The other woman looked worried, but she understood why Sydney felt as if she must do it. How could she not? Sydney was the model daughter all weekend, attending 2 balls, and having tea with 2 potential mothers-in-law. She acted like the daughter her mother had always wanted, instead of herself. Instead of long, tear-filled goodbyes, Sydney wrote a short note to her father, whom she was certain would understand why she was leaving. He'd always been an ally of sorts. I have gone west to marry. I will send you and mother a letter when I am settled into my new home. I do ask that you not tell mother for at least a week that you know what I've done. I do not want to marry the kind of man mother is determined for me to marry. I will be good. Love, Sydney. She left the note on his desk for him to find the following morning. There was a train that left Beckham at 6 every morning, heading west, and she planned to be on it. She'd switch trains as she needed to, contemplating and then discarding the idea of traveling to California and seeing the entire country from her own private sleeping car, but she realized it wasn't a good idea. No, she'd stick with the original plan and marry Randy Ranch. Fort Worth, Texas sounded like the Wild West anyway. Asterisk. Days later, Sydney arrived in Fort Worth, Texas, tired and dirty. It had been a long train ride, and she was ready to just sleep in a bed that didn't make sounds. She'd thought the train was a great adventure until she'd gotten on it, and the adventure had worn off within an hour. No, Fort Worth would have to be her home because she was not getting on that thing again. She got her bicycle from the luggage car and picked up her carpet bag. Now she must find Mr. Randy Ranch. As she wandered away from the train station, she realized she was not in a good part of town. She got onto her bike and turned around, heading north instead of south. The buildings and houses there seemed to be in better order. She stopped at the first business she saw, a general store, and she wandered inside. Hello. I'm looking for Randy Ranch. Sydney was dressed in bloomers and pushing her bicycle. The woman behind the counter looked her up and down. You looking for the man or the house? I don't know what the house is. No, I'm looking for the man. The woman scratched her head. Well, he owns all the businesses on this block, but he doesn't often make an appearance. Mr. Ranch is an important man. Can you tell me where I might find him then? Sydney asked. She wasn't sure what was so complicated about finding the man if he was as prominent as it seemed. He's probably at the house. What house? Sydney asked, growing a little more confused by the moment. The brothel, Randy's Ranch. Sydney stared at the woman for a moment. Brothel? This man owns a brothel? How could she have come this far to marry a brothel owner? No, she had to figure out how to change things. He does. Is that not the man you're looking for? No, I don't believe it is. Could you perchance tell me how I might find Mrs. Susan Dailey? The Dailey Ranch is a few miles outside of town. That's all right. I brought my bicycle. Though she was tired and had hoped to sleep immediately, it obviously wasn't going to happen. The woman made her a map, explaining where to turn. Sydney thanked her. May I have a glass of water before I head out there? It's hot. The woman smiled. It's only April. Wait until July. I think I'd rather not, Sydney said with a grin. She wasn't certain she would be able to survive the heat of the summer if it was this hot in April. The woman gave her a glass of water and Sydney gave her a silver dollar for her trouble. I thank you for taking the time to help me. But, this is a day's wage. That's all right. The help is appreciated. Sydney handed the empty glass back to the other woman and set out on her bike in the direction the woman had indicated. She wouldn't be sleeping in a brothel or with a brothel owner that night. Just as she thought she'd gone too far, she saw the street the woman had said to turn on. From there she was on empty roads with fields as far as the eye could see. It was interesting to see the difference between Massachusetts and Texas. It took her half an hour to reach the ranch, and she was thrilled when it came into view. She could see the stable, much larger than the barn, next to the blue house she'd been told Mrs. Dailey lived in. She rested her bike against the stairs for the front porch and climbed them, knocking on the door. The woman who answered the door was older, more her grandmother's age, than Mrs. Tandy's. I'm looking for Mrs. Susan Dailey? Yes, of course. The woman gave her bicycle a strange look, but then she opened the door wide. If you'll wait in the parlor. Sydney gratefully sat in the chair indicated by the woman and closed her eyes for a moment. She was used to riding long distances, but not in the heat. That heat felt as if it was the very hottest day of summer. It was brutal. Sydney wasn't certain how long she sat there before she opened her eyes, looking around her. A woman who was much closer to Mrs. Tandy's age sat with a little girl on her lap, watching her sleep. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep. Mrs. Dailey smiled, nodding. I don't mind. Could you tell me who you are? Sydney burst into laughter. I suppose that information would help. My name is Sydney Weatherby, and I was sent to Fort Worth by your sister, Elizabeth. Now you're starting to make sense. I came here to marry a Randy Ranch, but when I arrived, I found out he was a brothel owner, and I'm not even supposed to know what a brothel is. Oh my. Well, Mr. Ranch owns a good portion of Fort Worth. You don't want to marry him. He spends more time in his own businesses, including the Red Door Saloon and gambling establishment, than he should. Mrs. Dailey shook her head. So, do you want to stay here and find a husband with me, or do you want to take that long train ride back to Beckham? You'd let me stay? Sydney was shocked at the offer. Well, sure. My sister sent you here, so I'll help out. We have room, now that our two oldest boys have moved out. The oldest is even married. Well, maybe you should introduce me to your second oldest then, Sydney said, joking. That's not a bad idea, Mrs. Dailey said. You're sure pretty, and looking at your bloomers, I'd say you like adventure. I do. I enjoy riding my bicycle more than anything. I was joking about you introducing your son, though I would like to stay. I can pay room and board. Sydney had always saved the money she'd been given by her parents for ribbons for her hair. She had enough ribbons. Who on earth needed to buy more? There's no need for that. You just meet people and see what you see. It'll be fun to have another Beckham woman around. Do you know Alice Miller? Sydney thought for a moment and then remembered a girl who had worked for the Mercantile back in Beckham. Oh, sure. Everyone knows Alice. She's married to my oldest son, so there will be 3 of us Beckham ladies here. Wait, I thought Alice and Mrs. Tandy were sisters? Oh, they are. And you and Elizabeth are sisters? Mrs. Dailey looked highly amused at the confusion on Sydney's face. My 4 oldest are sons by marriage. Sydney nodded. I'm so glad to hear that. She'd been picturing not so nice things until that information was shared. You need to call me Susan. Let me show you to the room you can use, and I'll let Mrs. Hackenschleimer know you're staying here. Is that who answered the door? Susan nodded. Yes, she came with the house, husband, and 4 oldest sons. She's our housekeeper. I see. Well, I'm thrilled to meet her too. Texas is hot. Yes, it is. I miss colder weather only in the summers though. Susan got to her feet. We have a couple of hours before supper if you want to nap or bathe. And don't worry, we don't dress for supper, and your bloomers won't be a problem at all. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate your hospitality. Sydney was surprised at how a kind person could turn a dreadful day into a good one. Perhaps it was the entire Miller family who could do so. She knew Elizabeth had, and Alice had been kind to her at the store where she worked. We'll send Elizabeth a telegram letting her know you're all right. Tell her it's not time to tell my parents yet, please. Susan grinned. Your parents don't know you're here? No, and until I'm married, it would be best if they didn't. Sydney sighed, wishing her mother didn't have to worry, but she would not be returning to Beckham. Not ever. I understand. Elizabeth has helped several young women under similar circumstances. Thank you for being willing to take me in. I could stay in a boarding house or something if you'd rather, and can show me where a boarding house is. That's what I did when I first arrived. But no, stay here. It'll be fun. Sydney smiled. I appreciate your hospitality. I think I will sleep. And I'll bathe after supper if that's not too much trouble. Not at all. Susan led Sydney up the stairs, and to a door to the left at the top of the stairs. This will be your bedroom for now. I'll send one of the boys to wake you for supper. Is there anything you want now? A glass of water would make me the happiest woman alive. Give me a minute, and I will ensure your happiness. With that, Susan left. Sydney looked around the small room, unpacking her carpet bag. There wouldn't be enough room for her clothes when they arrived, but there was enough for what she had at the moment. She pulled back the covers to get ready to sleep as soon as she'd had her water. A knock at the door had her opening it to a young pregnant woman. I'm Alice. I remember you shopping at the store in Beckham with your mother. She handed Sydney a drink of water. Sydney drained it before thanking her. I appreciate that so much. The Texas heat is awful. It is. Glad to see you here. Susan explained what happened. You should marry my brother-in-law, Louis. He's been talking for a while about sending off for a bride. Sydney frowned. Not sure I could do that, now that I can see it almost got me into some big trouble. Louis is a good man. Susan, and I'll work on you. Sydney laughed. I'll meet him, but I'm not promising to marry him. That's good. Because we're not looking for a promise. Alice smiled sweetly. My husband, Albert, and I, our daughter, and Louis are all coming to dinner tonight. We want to give you a proper welcome. So glad you're here. Me too. You don't ride a bike by any chance, do you? Alice looked down at her swollen middle. I'm not so sure that would be a good idea right now. Sydney grinned. I'll teach you after the baby is born. That sounds like fun to me. I remember always seeing you ride up and down the street in front of the store. You look so free when you ride. And you're faster than all the boys. That was my favorite part, I'm afraid. Alice laughed. It would have been mine too. I can't ride a bike, but I can outshoot all the boys. Sounds like we have skills to trade. Sydney hid a yawn behind her hand. Oh, I'm so sorry. Susan said you were about to nap. I'll go, let you sleep, and I'll see you at supper. I can't wait to get to know you better. Sydney smiled. We were never friends in Beckham, and I come here, and we're going to be best friends, aren't we? I sure hope so. Alice replied. And sisters-in-law, if I have my way. Sydney shook her head as her new friend walked toward the top of the stairs, closing her door. Sleep was all she cared about. She undressed to her bloomers and corset, untied the strings of her corset, and collapsed onto the bed. It was soft, but not cloyingly soft like her bed in Beckham. The window was open and a nice breeze was coming through the room. She was going to like Texas. There was no doubt in her mind about that. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about how horrid her life would have been if she'd married the owner of a brothel who spent all his time in it. Maybe jumping on a train and taking off across the country wasn't the smartest thing she'd ever done. But staying in Beckham and marrying her mother's choice of beaus would have been the absolute worst thing she'd ever done in her entire life. She was glad she'd left, even if she had narrowly escaped a bad situation. She was in the arms of a loving family now, and they would treat her right. She could feel it with everything inside her. Thank goodness she'd asked Mrs. Tandy for Susan's last name. She shuddered, thinking about how her life could have turned out if she hadn't asked one simple question. Sleep took a while in coming after those dreadful thoughts. But once she was asleep, it was all over. It was a quiet, dreamless sleep. Well, sort of. She dreamed she was sleeping beside a too-hot fireplace, but it was better than where her dreams could have gone. Chapter 3. When she was woken for supper that evening, Sydney immediately got up and washed her face and hands with the pitcher and bowl in the corner of her room. Someone must have filled it while she slept, which told her she'd slept a great deal harder than she'd thought. The words, like a rock, came to mind. She was usually a light sleeper, but she was very comfortable with the Dailey family. She went down the stairs, listening to the sounds of laughter. She knew it would be easy to always find the family. They were apparently loud when they were all together. When she reached the sound of the voices, she found them all in a large sitting room, all of them casually dressed. As soon as she entered the room, Susan walked to her side. This is Sydney, who came here as a mail-order bride, she said, smiling. Two young men who looked identical looked at another young man. Don't look at me, the man being looked at said. I thought about sending for a mail-order bride, but I didn't actually do it. I was half afraid Aunt Elizabeth was going to send me a member of the demon horde like she did Albert. Sydney smiled. Louis. That has to be Louis. Then her eyes widened. Wait, your family was known as the demon horde? Sydney asked Susan. I knew it was a local farmer's children, but no one ever said it was the Millers. You're practically famous in Beckham. Alice stood to one side. Famous? Don't you mean infamous? She asked, picking up a little girl and holding her close. We'll eat soon, Rachel. Rachel rested her head on her mama's shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 18 months old. Susan frowned. Are you trying to starve my niece-granddaughter? Alice nodded. Yes, she hasn't ever been fed. See how she's wasting away to nothing? Everyone laughed at that. The little girl was more than a little chubby, and as cute as could be. Mrs. Hackenschleimer stepped into the room then. Supper's on the table. Not knowing where the dining room was, Sydney followed along behind the family. She was hungrier than she'd realized. She could smell delicious food filling the air. Something smells wonderful. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes, Louis said, leaning close. It's what she always serves first-time guests. Her fried chicken is worth crossing the country for. Well, then I'll be certain to get a big piece, Sydney said, wanting to study the man, but also not wanting to be rude. So far, everyone had assumed she was there to marry him. Perhaps he was a good candidate for a possible husband. He was seated across from her at the table, and Sydney was glad. She could watch how he interacted with family as well as have a chance to really look at him and not be considered rude. The identical young men were on either side of him, but they looked as if they were a little too young to marry her. Perhaps 17 or 18? Sydney couldn't help but wonder if they were Susan's children or some that were hers by marriage, like Louis and Albert. Susan sat at the foot of the table, with David at the head. Once David had prayed over the meal, Susan introduced her to each of the people at the table. She had been right about Louis, and she quickly discovered that the twins were Susan's stepsons, though they both called her Ma and seemed to think of her as their mother. How many children do you have? Sydney finally asked. David has 10. I've given birth to 6 of them, but I think of all of them as my children. Susan looked down the table at Louis. Even the 2 pranksters. Wait, are Albert and Louis the pranksters? Sydney asked, her eyes wide. They are. But, how could you let a member of the demon horde marry a prankster? Sydney looked at little Rachel, half expecting to see horns pop out of the girl's hair. I didn't know Elizabeth had sent another of our sisters. Alice was only 5 when I left Beckham, and the 3 of them, Albert, Alice, and Louis, conspired against me, not telling me that Alice was my sister. They even made up a fake last name for her. Susan looked at the 3 of them, and not one of them looked guilty. They instead looked awfully pleased with themselves. What a way to greet a sister you haven't seen in 15 years. Sydney shook her head. Your family's pranks were considered epic tales of fun by most of the children around Beckham. None of the churches would let the children go there very long. Usually within a month, the pastor would take the parents aside and tell them their children are corruptive influences on the rest of the young men and women in the church. Alice nodded. We never did last longer than a couple of months at a church. We scared lots of teachers away too. Now the school board will only hire men, and the men need to be willing to not spare the rod. You must have gone to the country school south of town? Susan frowned. We did. The 4 oldest children in my family were always well behaved because Ma and Pa would switch us if we weren't. By the time Alice came around, Ma was so tired trying to deal with so many kids, there was no discipline at all unless it was either Elizabeth or me dishing it out. I truly feel like I'm in the midst of greatness. Susan sighed. I got away from all the younger siblings, and then married David to find myself the mother of 2, just like those siblings. She shook her head. You'd think I was doing something to attract them all, but I really wasn't. I can't believe you went through with the marriage when they were so ill-behaved. I guess you should hear the whole story of my marriage, Susan said, taking a bite of her chicken before continuing. I came here to marry David's brother, but he was killed in a shootout in Hell's Half-Acre before I arrived. What is Hell's Half-Acre? Sydney asked, confused. It's the bad part of town south of the railroad station where you came into town, Louis said. You should never go there. It's not safe. Why even Butch Cassidy has been spotted there. I was there today. I got frightened and turned to walk back toward the railroad station, and I didn't stop until I was in an area that didn't look so run down, Sydney said, feeling like the world's biggest idiot. As you were saying, Susan? Yes, so my fiancé was killed, so David met me at the station, telling me what happened but offering to marry me instead. He told me he was a widower with 4 children. I insisted on having supper with the family so I could see how his children behaved before I would agree, not wanting to be saddled with children just like my brothers and sisters. So, David paid Albert and Louis to behave, hoping I'd marry him if they weren't as ill-behaved as normal. Sydney's jaw dropped, and she turned to look at David, pointing with her fork. You did that? David just smirked at her, raising one shoulder in a shrug. He did that, Susan said. Within minutes of the wedding being over, the boys were acting as they usually did though, and I knew. I was so furious with the man, but I'd already spoken my words, and I wasn't about to go home. Not with the demon horde waiting there for me. That's terrible. Sydney couldn't believe these two were still married, and they had 6 children. Louis grinned at her. We tried to behave, sometimes. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I mean, the story is funny, but how can I trust any of you? Alice smiled. Susan and I will always tell you the truth. Don't worry about the others. Sydney sat back in her chair, carefully cutting a bite of chicken from the breast she'd selected. Everyone stared at her as she took her first bite. Oh, it's good. Do you always eat fried chicken with a knife and fork? Susan asked, helping Sydney to understand what the looks were about. I don't know that I've ever had fried chicken, Sydney said. My mother has never liked chicken, so it was never served. Alice grinned. Your mother is the sort who probably would eat it with a knife and fork. Most people just pick it up and bite in, though. It's one of those foods that is fine to eat with your fingers. Sydney picked up the chicken for her second bite and just bit right into it. You're right. It tastes much better this way. I wonder if I would like spinach if I ate it with my fingers. No, you wouldn't, Alice said, making a face. After supper, Sydney stood and offered to help with the dishes, but Susan refused. You just got here. Why don't you go for a nice walk? I'm sure Louis wouldn't mind accompanying you. There are wild animals around, so it doesn't make sense to go alone. Despite the fact that she knew Susan was trying to get her to marry her second stepson, Sydney agreed. That sounds enjoyable. Perhaps he can tell me about the ranch. Louis got to his feet and offered Sydney his arm, ignoring the giggles of his younger siblings. Yes, let's go for a walk. As soon as they were out of the house, Louis started talking about the operations of the ranch. We run some cattle, but we've never had a huge number here. Albert is the cattle rancher in the family. Pa breeds and trains horses. If a local rancher needs a horse broken, he'll bring it to Pa, but the majority of his work is done on the horses we breed here on the ranch. I oversee the breeding, and Pa does the training. My younger brothers, the twins, are learning to train them as well as Pa takes some of the work off Pa's shoulders. Do you enjoy breeding horses? Back east, the question would have been considered indelicate. Here? It seemed to come out of her mouth naturally. I do. We have one of the best studs around, and we're always buying mares. I actually ride out to different ranches around, seeing what the quality of their mares is, and I bring a lot home. That's my part in the whole thing. Then I choose which mares are bred when. I've got my eye on another stud, but we're trying to decide if it's worth the price. That sounds interesting. When you ride out to places, do you go on a horse or on a bicycle? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. A horse. A horse breeder who goes everywhere on a bicycle would be frowned on, don't you think? Probably. I just happen to love riding my bicycle, and I wondered if you rode too. It occurred to her that it would be a wonderful courting activity, riding bicycles together. There were even bicycles built for two they could share the work of pedaling on. It sounded like a great deal of fun to her. Louis leaned against a fence, both of his forearms against the wood. I've never tried. I don't have a problem with bicycles, but horses are more convenient around here. I can understand that. How do you feel about women who wear bloomers and ride bicycles? She asked. If it was something that bothered him, there would be no reason to set her cap for him. None at all. I think women should wear what's comfortable for them. Susan wears split skirts when she rides, and so does Alice. They just work better with the horses. I've seen horses get spooked by a skirt and almost kill a woman who was trying to mount it. So, I think bloomers should be worn on horses as well. And I think women should do things for fun and not always work. I don't think Susan remembers what fun is. She thinks it's relaxing to have several women over for tea, and then all of them do their mending together. Oh, trust me. I always have fun. She glanced over at him in the waning sunlight. Are you looking for a wife? She'd found she preferred straightforward questions. She would never know if she didn't ask. I haven't really been looking, but I'm not averse to the idea either. Say if a woman who was supposed to marry someone else came into town, realized the man was not suitable for her to marry, well then, I might be interested. Sydney grinned. I see. How would you know if you were interested? Or more importantly, how would the young lady in question know if you were interested? She was finding herself more and more enamored of the man by the moment. When everyone had started telling her she needed to marry Louis, she'd thought they were just being silly, or trying to get her to marry an undesirable man. Now she knew he was a truly viable option. Well, I guess if the woman appealed to me physically, then I'd try to get to know her a little better. I don't want to marry a woman who thinks it's my job to keep the house, or thinks she needs to constantly have a servant working for her. Albert had a crush on a woman like that for a while, and neither of us wanting to marry a woman who would sit around reading dime novels all day instead of working. And once you got to know her some? How would you let her know you were interested in a little more than just a casual acquaintance? She persisted. Well, I think I'd probably take her waist in my hands, like so, he said, putting his words to action. And then I'd probably try to steal a kiss. When his lips pressed against hers, she felt a shiver run up her spine. Many men had stolen kisses from her, but they all bored her. Not Louis. Once he raised his head, she looked at him, wondering what would happen next. I see. Then I'd tell my ma that I wanted to know everything about the girl, and she'd figure out how to find that stuff out. Probably by asking the girl herself. That makes sense. And then I'd have her over for supper, and let my pa and Susan tell me what they thought of her after. In my experience, when you marry the whole family, and not just one person. But once I found out that they liked her, I may just propose that fast. I don't see a need for grass to grow under my feet. We should probably head inside, Sydney said softly. She was still so tired from her journey. I'll be curious to know what your parents thought of me. Me too. Once they reached the house, Sydney sought out Susan and bid her good night. She was too tired to stay up much longer. I promise I won't sleep this much tomorrow, she said with a laugh. Susan shook her head. It's going to take a few days for you to recover from that journey. I hope you're wrong, and I'm at full strength tomorrow. I want to help with the chores. I'd like that a lot. Good night, Sydney. Good night, Susan. Sydney turned to David and then to Louis, both of whom were right there. Good night, gentlemen. I'll see you tomorrow. With that, she went upstairs to find the comfortable bed she'd napped on for so long. A bath could wait until morning. Chapter 4. Sydney realized when she woke just before noon the following day that Susan had been right. It was going to take her a few days to recover from the long journey, followed by the bicycle ride in such a hot and humid climate. She had lunch with Susan and Alice, who had decided to join them, and the children who were not yet in school. The topic of conversation didn't turn to Lewis. It started and ended there. "What did you think of Lewis?" Alice asked. "Isn't he a handsome, kind man?" "He was very nice," Sydney replied. She didn't want to say too much with his mother and sister-in-law sitting right there. Susan grinned. "He was certainly infatuated with you. He asked what his father and I think of you, and we told him we would readily approve of a courtship. We haven't discussed that yet." "Not outright." She'd asked, and he'd given her most of an answer, but she was waiting to see him again before she really knew anything. "Well, you should," Alice said. "I understand your parents don't know you're here?" "They don't. If they did, my mother would have a man here taking me home to Beckham, whether I was kicking and screaming or not. I told my father what I was doing in a note, but asked him not to tell my mother until I'd been gone for a full week. I was afraid she would find me somehow and force me to marry a boor, or a bore." Sydney spelled both of the homonyms out so the others would know what she meant. Susan and Alice both laughed. "I would think that means you need to marry quickly, though, doesn't it?" Alice asked, not willing to give up the subject. "You're like a dog with a bone," Sydney said. "Yes, it would be best if I married quickly. I do worry my parents will find me here." "I think Lewis is a good choice," Alice said. "As do I," Susan echoed her younger sister. "I like him fine, but I'm certainly not in love with him." "That comes with time," the two sisters said in unison. All of them laughed. "You both say that because you were mail-order brides, and initially your marriages were loveless." Susan sighed. "You came here to be a mail-order bride. Why not at least consider Lewis? I promise you he's as well trained as I could manage, and he rarely pees on the ceiling in the bathroom anymore." Sydney let out a bark of laughter. "Did he do that when he was young?" Susan nodded. "He once even asked my husband to paint a target on the ceiling, and David considered it. Until they talked to me, of course." "I'm glad you were able to talk some sense into them," Sydney said. "It sounds like he's been a difficult child." Susan shrugged. "I thought my life was over when I realized what Albert and Lewis were really like. But I got to know them and grew to love them both quickly. They were definitely no worse than Alice was." Alice gave her sister her best innocent look. "I never tried to pee on the ceiling, though." Susan simply shook her head. "If Lewis wants to court me, I'm more than willing." "Just stay open-minded about it," Susan said. "You need to marry, and he's available, and I know he's attracted to you." "That's true." Alice nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, give him a chance. You two should come over for supper tonight." She clapped her hands together excitedly. "I'll make chicken and dumplings, and we'll all talk. I want to get to know you better too. You're my new best friend whether we like it or not." Sydney smiled. "I think we both like it." Alice grinned. "Yes, we do." After their lunch, Sydney looked around the house to see if anything needed done, but she saw nothing. "I'd be happy to help with anything you need. Would you like me to do some laundry? Wash windows? Scrub floors?" "I know how." Susan and Alice exchanged a glance. "What?" Sydney asked, needing to understand the silent communication between the sisters. Alice answered for them both. "Only a woman who has grown up in a wealthy family would brag they knew how to clean. Susan and I were both cleaning every day from the day we were old enough to drag a kitchen chair to the basin so we could wash and wipe the dishes dry." Sydney felt strange all at once. "My mother didn't allow me to clean. She said it was servants' work. But I worked at the orphanage outside of town, and I learned how to cook and clean there. And I learned a lot about children. She couldn't cook a lot of meals, but the ones she did know how to make, she made well." "Do you want children?" Susan asked. Sydney shrugged. "I do want them. I wanted to adopt one of the boys at the orphanage, but I would have needed my mother's permission, and she was afraid it would keep me from finding the husband she wanted for me. Your mother sounds perfectly awful, Susan said. Alice nodded. Oh, she was. She was always telling Sydney what she should and shouldn't do. I was stocking shelves at the store one day, and I heard her give Sydney a whole lecture on how she was to sit when someone was over for tea. It lasted for more than 20 minutes. I was ready to stick cotton in my ears, so I didn't have to hear another word of it. Sydney shrugged. I remember when she did that. She lectured me about everything from asking boys to race bicycles with me, to telling me ladies don't spit in public. I didn't listen very often. Alice blinked. Did you spit in public? Never. But I told my mother I liked to spit in public to get a rise out of her. She was very vocal about what was right and wrong for a lady to do. Her favorite was, a lady must never touch a man she's not married to. Not even when dancing with them. How am I supposed to waltz with a man if I can't touch him? She never would answer that question. Did she allow you to waltz with men? If they were suitable in her eyes, she did. Alice groaned. I cannot bear the thought of going back to Beckham and being under her rule again. I would simply rather die. Susan shook her head. That's a little too dramatic. No, you should not go back to Beckham. I think you should marry Lewis. I'll insist. I won't have a man who is forced to marry me. We'll work it out. At that point, there was a loud knock on the door. A man stood with a huge trunk and a letter for Susan. Susan eyed the trunk, but quickly opened the letter. This is from Elizabeth. She told me to find you so I can give you this. Looking at the trunk once more, Susan's eyes met Sydney's. All those clothes are not going to fit in your small room. Lewis has more room at his house, Alice said, once again bringing the conversation back to Lewis. It seemed that it would be impossible to talk of anything else with Susan and Alice around. I won't unpack them all, Sydney said. But I may unpack all my bloomers. Since no one has seemed shocked by them yet, I think I'll wear them all the time. Susan grinned. You should. I don't care if anyone is bothered by them. They look so terribly comfortable. They are. Sydney insisted. I love wearing them so much. Especially when I ride my bicycle. You'll teach me to ride it after the baby comes? Alice asked, looking toward the front door as if she was trying to catch another peek at the strange contraption. Of course I will. It's really easy. Alice looked at Susan. What about you? Are you going to learn? Susan shook her head. I'd like to, but I can't risk being injured. Alice's jaw dropped. You're pregnant again, aren't you? Susan frowned. I thought I was too old for more babies after 3 years without conceiving, but apparently I was wrong. Sydney smiled. That's wonderful news. Says the woman with no children, Susan said. This will give me 11 children. 11. Sounds like a good start to me, Sydney replied. She was mostly joking, but she loved children. The orphanage had been her favorite place to be, and she'd sneaked away to go there every time she could get away with it. Oh, Lord. She even speaks like Lewis does about children. He wants a lot? Sydney asked, wanting to know so much more about Lewis without asking outright. She didn't want them to know she was interested in him, because they would redouble their efforts to get her and Lewis married off then. Alice nodded. He wants an even dozen at least. That's what he says anyway. Do you want a lot of children, Alice? Sydney tried again to steer the subject away from her and Lewis. I'd like several. Right after Rachel was born, I decided no more, but I can't keep to that. Alice shrugged. And apparently my husband and I can't keep our hands to ourselves, so there will be more babies. Susan nodded. Just like his father. I'm sure Louis will be similar. I guess it's nice knowing they don't stray when looking for affections, Sydney said. After clearing the table together, Susan sent Sydney home with Alice. Show her your house, and you two have some fun while the baby naps. Alice nodded. Absolutely. Come see my house. Sydney didn't argue. Instead, she followed her friend out the door and toward another part of the ranch. Do you live on the same ranch? Alice shook her head. No, but we live on an adjacent property. Albert is buying up as much property as he can so we can run more cattle. Our herd is already one of the biggest in the area, but he tells me we need more. I'm just glad I'm not the one having to build all the fences and do the real work. It's nice to just stay at home and do the housework and cook. Tell me about chicken and dumplings, Sydney said. I've seen them, but never eaten them. Are they as good as the orphans said they were? Alice frowned. Your mother, not eating chicken has really made you miss out on some awfully tasty food. I guess it has. Alice described chicken and dumplings to Sydney, and Sydney was excited to try them. I can't wait. I'll make a cake as well. Everyone loves cakes. I do love cakes. Her mother had been against her eating sweets as well. She'd always been worried she'd gain weight. Then we'll have one. They walked some distance before Alice opened the door to a small house. This is my house. Sydney stepped inside to find a house perfectly in order. There didn't seem to be a speck of dirt anywhere. Is your house always this clean? She asked, trying to look in every direction at once. Alice grinned. I don't have enough children to keep me terribly busy yet, so I clean. It keeps me doing something. When I finish cleaning, I head over to Susan's, and we spend the rest of the day sewing, or I help her with her chores. Being a housewife is rather lonely work. But it's good here because you have each other? I'm starting to understand why you want me to marry Louis so badly. You want another friend around. Another sister, Alice said with a smile. I do think you and Louis will be good together though. Did he kiss you? Sydney blushed. What kind of question is that? One that doesn't need to be answered now that I see your blush. Tell me, did it make your toes curl? For a moment, Sydney considered denying it, but she decided she wanted the other woman's advice too much. It did. Is that normal? Alice laughed. It's normal when it's the right man. Right after we were married, a man decided he wanted me instead of his own wife. Long story, but he tried to kiss me. I wanted to vomit because the very thought of him kissing me made me sick to my stomach. Albert is the right man, without a doubt. And because my toes curled, Louis is the right man? I think so. You need to see if you can stand to be in one another's presence, of course, but failing hostility between you, I'd say he's the man you should marry. I will think on that. Thanks for being honest with me. No problem. We're best friends, remember? You can ask me anything. I will probably take you up on that. Not right now, though. I want to see the rest of this house of yours. Rachel fell asleep on the way home. I'm going to put her in her bed, and then we'll look around some more. She'll nap for a good hour or two while I start supper. I'll teach you to make my chicken and dumplings. They're even better than Susan's. Are Susan's any good? They're fabulous. But mine are better. Sydney smiled at the other woman's confidence in her cooking. Then I need to learn from the best, don't I? It would have never occurred to Sydney that cooking with a friend would be fun, but she and Alice laughed most of the afternoon as Sydney tried her hand at cutting dumplings for the first time. It was truly a joyful day, very different than one she'd be having in Beckham. Sydney owed a huge debt to the Miller family for not only sending her to Fort Worth, but for giving her a place to live and people to have fun with. She was very thankful she'd gotten up the nerves to knock on Elizabeth's door. She didn't yet know what being a bride would be like, but she certainly loved the sisters she'd come into contact with. For once, Sydney didn't have to worry about getting her clothes messy or disturbing her perfect hairstyle. She could just be Sydney, and that was all she'd ever asked for. Chapter 5. Sydney wasn't even a little bit surprised to see Louis walk into Alice's house with Albert that evening. Alice grinned at her brother-in-law. "Oh, good. I was hoping I could rope you into having supper with us." "I'm surprised Susan let you steal her guest for the evening," Louis said, grinning at Sydney. "Me too," Alice said. "I think she was hoping her ultimate plans will be better served with a small group of people at supper." Sydney rolled her eyes. "Just say it. She wants Louis and I to marry and give her a dozen grandchildren." "Make that 24, and you'll be right," Louis said, winking at her. "She loves the idea of having children she can spoil and then send home to their parents. She's very good at doing just that," Alice said, looking down at little Rachel, who was playing on the floor with an old rag doll. "I'm almost afraid to even think about that," Sydney said, shaking her head. "I feel like people are trying to plan my life for me, just like they did back in Beckham." Alice stopped what she was doing and looked at her new friend. "Not at all. It's all good-natured. If you meet a man at church you prefer, no one would be even the least bit upset. You are free to marry whomever you wish here." "I do hope you wish to marry me, though," Louis said. "I've had a meal with you, taken a walk with you, and shared one kiss. I have a feeling I should know you a little better than that before I agree to marry you." "Another kiss or two might convince her," Albert said, slapping his brother on the shoulder. "Maybe if she saw my house," Louis said. Albert shook his head. "Looks just like mine. And now I've saved your reputation from ruin, and you don't have to be alone in Louis's house with him." Sydney laughed. "I think it's silly for reputations to be ruined so easily. My mother had maids following me for a long time, but then when I started riding my bicycle, they couldn't keep up." "I want to take a turn on that contraption of yours," Louis said, smiling at her. "Would you mind teaching me to ride?" "I'd love to. I can't teach Susan or Alice since they're both expecting, but I can teach any of you menfolk." Louis and Albert exchanged a glance. "Susan is expecting again?" Albert asked. "Oh, was that supposed to be a secret?" Sydney felt terrible breaking the news to Susan's stepsons that way. She was certain the other woman would prefer to tell people herself. Alice shrugged. "She didn't tell us it was a secret, so you can't be upset with yourself for saying something." Sydney sighed. "I guess I can't, but it still feels as though I've done something wrong." "You haven't." Alice put the food on the table before picking up Rachel and putting her in her high chair. Once the four adults were sitting, they bowed their heads automatically, and Louis said a prayer over the meal. "I love your chicken and dumplings even more than Susan's," Louis said, looking excited about the meal. "It looks and smells delicious," Sydney said, looking forward to trying the new meal. "Wait until you taste it," Albert said excitedly. "I could eat this every night for a month." "A beef rancher loving chicken that much? Isn't that against the law?" Louis asked his brother. "SHHHSH," Albert said. Louis laughed as he took his first bite of the dumplings, looking ecstatic. "Best batch I've had the pleasure of eating, Alice. Are you sure you don't want to get rid of this awful husband of yours and marry me? I'd let you cook this every night." Alice just smiled, watching Sydney to see her reaction. Sydney cut off a little piece of a dumpling with her spoon, and got some gravy and a bit of chicken, wanting to try all the flavors at once. She took one bite and smiled happily. "This is wonderful. I've missed out on so much with my mother hating chicken." "Don't worry. You'll have all those experiences here with us," Louis said with a grin. "Well, unless she married someone else." He found he was already feeling bereft at the thought. He needed to get her to agree to marry him before they went to church on Sunday, and she met all the cowboys who would wander in for the service. "There's a church social on Saturday night," Albert pointed out, nudging his brother. "Would you care to go to the church social with me?" Lewis asked. Sydney nodded, a smile transforming her face from merely pretty to absolutely beautiful. "I would love to. I've never been to a church social." She didn't know what was supposed to happen at a church social, but she'd wear a pretty dress and enjoy herself no matter what happened. Alice frowned. "Your mother was dragging you everywhere to find you a husband, and she never took you to a church social?" "That's how I met all the young men in the area. My mother didn't want me to marry just anyone. She was looking for a rich man who came from old wealth." Sydney rolled her eyes. "One of those boring men who talks about nothing but himself." Alice shook her head. "Your mother sounds like an odd one. I don't remember speaking to her often, but I certainly remember how she was with you. My mother didn't speak to people working in simple shops like the Mercantile. She was more interested in speaking to people in modiste shops. The most important thing in her world is making certain that I wore a gown that fitted me perfectly. If it didn't make my waist look tiny, then it wasn't good enough." "I'm glad you're here," Alice said softly. "And you really must marry before your parents discover where you are." Sydney nodded. "I know. I would rather wait for some time to get to know someone well, but I probably only have a week before I need to just marry anyone." Lewis frowned. "Are you saying I'm just anyone?" He felt as if she was not at all interested in him as he was in her. She wasn't just a marriage prospect to him. She was the woman he felt he'd waited his whole life for. "Not at all," Sydney said. "I'm sorry if that sounded rude. I just hate that I must be in a rush. I'd rather make you court me for a few years before we marry. And I'd rather be married to you tomorrow." "I'm not sure that's the best idea," Sydney said. "Let's at least give it till Sunday. Then we can enjoy the church social, and I can recover from my journey here before we do anything else." "All right," Lewis said. "Today's just Tuesday, so 5 days from now?" "I can wait that long for an answer, as long as you let me get to know you in the meantime." "Of course, I will," Sydney said. "Don't worry, you are first on my list." "There's a list?" Alice asked. Sydney shook her head. "You're all just trying to trap me into saying something I don't mean." Albert grinned at her. "I suppose you already know us." After supper was finished, Lewis invited Sydney to go for a walk. "Let me help with the dishes first," Sydney replied. Alice shook her head. "No, you're our guest. I'll do the dishes." She made a shooing motion with her hand. "I'm perfectly capable of helping," Sydney said. Why had she learned all the skills she had at the orphanage if not to actually use them? "You'll be doing dishes as soon as you're married. Let us spoil you for a little while." "But I've been spoiled all my life." Alice just laughed and turned away. Sydney followed Lewis outside, and they walked in a different direction than they had the night before. After walking a short way, he pointed straight ahead. "That's my house. It really is exactly the same as Albert's." "Looks nice," she said. Sydney wasn't certain about being the wife of a horse breeder, but she really liked Lewis. What she knew of him anyway. "So, tell me what a typical day is like for you." "Well, I'm not much for cooking, so I start my day by going to my Pa and Susan's house. I eat breakfast with that crazy group. And then I go through the stable, checking each of the horses for any injuries or anything wrong with them. I check the Mara's cycles regularly, because I need to know when I should plan to breed them." "Wait," she said, stopping walking. "You actually put them together so they can make a baby?" He grinned. "How else do you think we breed them?" "I don't know. I guess I was picturing a little marriage ceremony where the mare wears a white veil and the stallion a tie. Then you make them a bed of roses in the stable, and hang curtains so they have their privacy." He laughed. Well, you certainly have an imagination. Perhaps you should write children's books about animals. Perhaps I will, she said, grinning at him. He led her into the stables and showed her their prize stallion. I'm still trying to find the perfect mare for him. We've bred him multiple times, and his foals always end up being the best ones we have. Of course, if we had the perfect mare for him, we'd have prize foals year after year. It would really help us out with the breeding and training business. Sydney took a step closer to the stall the stallion was in, stroking his nose with one hand. What's his name? She asked. Renegade. Hello, Renegade. She blew out a breath in the horse's face so he could get to know her scent. Louis was surprised. Have you been around horses a lot? Sydney grinned. I've always liked horses, and I ran down to the stable every minute I had to see them when I was a little girl. My mother didn't think a girl of my station should be spending much time with horses though, so I had to sneak away. She was more riled up when I rode my bicycle anyway. Louis grinned. And you wanted her riled up? It was the only time she showed any real emotion. When she was yelling at me. She wanted a boy, you see. I'm sorry. Does it help if I tell you that I like you just the way you are? He asked, catching her hand and pulling her to him for a stolen kiss. I think I like you just how you are as well. Oh, Louis, are we doing the right thing? We just met yesterday, and I feel like we're halfway to an engagement already. I don't know if it's the right thing for you, but you're certainly not my first opportunity to marry. I've met a lot of girls over the years, but you're the one who interests me the most. I already feel like I'm half in love with you, and you act as if I'm the first man you saw when you got into town, so you feel obligated to think about marrying me. That's not how I feel at all. I've never met any man that I could marry that I had any desire to marry. I just met all the terrible men my mother paraded me in front of, and then I met men that I wasn't allowed to marry. It's just a different feeling, and I'm afraid I'm jumping into things too quickly, though I don't have a choice. I know that probably didn't explain things at all. It did. I understand. But I do hope you'll choose me. To make things a bit easier, he dropped to one knee right there in the stable. Will you marry me? At the look of shock on her face, he said, You don't have to tell me now. If you'll give me an answer on Sunday, I will be very pleased. Sydney took a deep breath. You'll have your answer on Sunday. Thank you for allowing me a few days to just be Sydney, and not my mother's daughter, and not Mrs. Dailey. I need to be me for a little while if that makes sense. It does. I've never been in a position where I couldn't be me. I've always known that whoever I chose to be on a certain day would be just fine with my family. I think in your position, I might just feel the same as you do. Thank you for trying to understand me, Sydney said, waiting until Louis got back on his feet and throwing her arms around him. You are the only man I've ever met that I have a desire to consider marrying, if that's at all helpful. He chuckled. You just keep making me feel better and better. But he did understand. Whether he wanted to or not, he needed to know that she was going to be happy with whatever decision she made. He walked her back toward the main house on the ranch, where she was staying with Susan's family. How long have you had your own house? She asked as they walked along. A few years, he said, twining his fingers through hers. Albert and I built them at the same time. We'd build one bedroom, and then we'd go to the other house and build the exact same bedroom. I love my little house. And I'd make sure it was clean before we ever married. She laughed. I enjoy cleaning, but that's probably because I've never had to do it on a regular basis. I look forward to cleaning up after you and cooking your meals. You do? Does that mean you're leaning toward accepting my proposal? It does. You know I am. When they reached the house, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her goodnight. Dream of me and the life we'll have together once you stop being stubborn, he said. Stubborn? Before she could get riled up, he dropped a kiss on her nose. "I'll see you tomorrow." She smiled. Why does tomorrow sound like a promise all of a sudden and not like something I should dread? Because your mother is no longer ruling your every action. I just hope we're already married before she sends someone after you. I'm sure my papa will give me a head start and say he found the note later than he actually did. He never liked how mother would try to force things I didn't want on me. I hope you're right. I don't know if I could let you go back to Massachusetts. He kissed her once more and then opened his father's front door for her. Good night, Sydney. I'll see you in the evening. Sydney smiled, wondering if Susan would allow her to take over her kitchen. It might be nice to fix a meal for him all on her own, and they could eat it together, outside somewhere. It was certainly warm enough. That's one thing she could say for the Texas weather. It was warmer than it would have been in Beckham, and they could start having summer-type fun.